Hello everybody. So my name's Maxine and I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own experience with PSC. It's quite hard to fit it all into 15 minutes, so if there are any other questions at the end or in the break, just feel free to come and ask me. So it all started for me roughly in 2005 when I was in my last year of secondary school. I'd had glandular fever the year before, but I was still really tired all the time, even a year afterwards. So my mum knew that this wasn't normal, even though I was a big fan of sleep as a teenager, but she knew it wasn't normal for me, so she kept taking me back to the GP to try and find out what was going on. So after a year or so of blood tests, scans, referral to a gastroenterologist, liver biopsy, I was diagnosed with PSC. So I found out about my diagnosis by getting a letter in the post with my results from the biopsy. And like most of us, when we're diagnosed, I had no idea what PSC was or what it meant for me. So I started to Google, as I'm sure, again, many of us have done. So from Googling, I learned that I should be a man in his 40s with about 10 years left to live. So I was really scared and confused, and I felt really abnormal. Soon after this, I had a consultation with my gastro doctor, and he cleared a few things up for me. So he told me the facts about PSC. He told me that it's rare, that there is no cure, and that I would need to take tablets and have checkups for the rest of my life, and that I might need to have a liver transplant one day. But he did also tell me that many people live a full life with PSC and they die with it, not because of it. So this gave me a little bit of reassurance. And he also said that at the moment my disease was in fairly early stages, so if I were to need a liver transplant, it probably wouldn't be for many years. Basically, there was no way of knowing, but it was just a case of having those regular checkups, taking my tablets, and just keeping an eye on things. A few weeks after this, I also had to have a colonoscopy done because, as previously mentioned, PSC often comes with inflammatory bowel disease. So I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis as well. So I found the diagnosis quite hard to accept. I was in the middle of studying dance at college at the time. I was 17, and I was auditioning for a place at university. I found it really hard at first, and I didn't really know how to handle having a chronic illness. It wasn't something I knew much about. There's never a good age to be diagnosed with PSC or any chronic condition, but being a teenager is really hard enough as it is. There's a lot to deal with already, so it was really tough. It took me a while to adjust, but I tried to just let it not get to me and not stop me from doing the things I wanted to do or from living my life. So I managed to get into university, and off I went. I moved 3 hours away from home to study dance. And at this point, my symptoms were fairly under control. They weren't too bad at this point. But studying dance is quite intense, despite what many people think. So the fatigue and the pain and the itching, they weren't always easy to ignore. I also had bouts of illness at the time, which now looking back I know was cholangitis, but at the time I wasn't very aware of what that was or what I should do if I did get that. So I just put it down to overdoing it and just carried on. So I managed to do it and get through the 3 years of uni and had the best time of my life. I had loads of wonderful experiences at uni, met friends for life, and also took part in an exchange program where I studied in Canada for 6 months. Here's just some of the experiences I had. So PSC definitely wasn't stopping me at this point. Whilst I was at uni, I was still having regular blood tests done at the GP there, and then during the holidays, I was still going back to my local hospital to see my gastro doctor. And it was during this time, in my last year of uni, that a new narrowing was found in my common bile duct. Everything else was still okay at this point. My bloods hadn't got much worse. It was all pretty normal for me. But I was referred to Derriford Hospital in Plymouth, which is the closest liver unit to my home in Somerset, just so that they could advise what should happen going forwards, and if things should progress, they already knew about my history. So I finished uni and moved back home, trying to figure out what to do with my life after 3 years away from home. And I started a couple part-time jobs, teaching dance when I could, and again, my symptoms weren't any worse at this point. Then in 2011, a year after I finished university, I was diagnosed with portal hypertension and esophageal varices. Here's an explanation of portal hypertension from the PSC support website. Basically, it's when the blood pressure in the portal vein in the liver is high and due to scarring of the liver. I'm going to stop my explanation there because I know that there's doctors in the room. It won't be right. Thanks. But basically what it meant is that my PSC had progressed. So I was put on beta blockers to reduce the high blood pressure and was told that I'd need to have more regular checkups. Oops. So I still felt fairly okay at this point. I was still able to carry on with life. The fatigue was a little bit worse, but it was manageable. So I decided to go back to Canada for a 3-month trip, just to go back and live there and just enjoy some free time after I saved up enough money working hard. And then I came back from that trip in 2011 and had a follow-up endoscopy in the new year. And during this, it was seen that I'd had, the varices had got bigger, so they were at risk of bleeding, and I needed to have them banded. 2 or 3 weeks after I had the banding done, I was at work, and I felt a crippling fatigue coming over me during the day. My whole body felt like lead, and I couldn't push past it like I normally would, but I just thought I was coming down with a bug, so I just decided to have an early night. But that night is when everything changed. So I was rushed to hospital in the middle of the night after vomiting a lot of blood. Basically, the varices had ruptured and caused a hemorrhage. I was treated in A&E where I had blood transfusions and was taken to theatre to have the bleeding stopped. I stayed in hospital for 10 days, and this is when I was told that my PSC had now progressed significantly. I think this is the first time when I realised that PSC is actually really bad and that it could really change my life. I'd always managed to push past it in the past and carry on, but it finally pulled me to a halt. To cut a very long story short, I'd had another bleed 2 weeks after this, and this time had to have a TIPS procedure done at Derriford Hospital. Again, I'm going to keep my explanation short, but it's basically where they put a mesh stent in the liver to allow the blood to flow through easier and to reduce the risk of another bleed happening. So because this meant that my disease had progressed quite a lot, my treatment options were running out, so it was decided that I'd need to have a transplant assessment at Derriford Hospital, and I had this done a couple months after my TIPS procedure. So at this transplant assessment, I had a lung function test, had to have the exercise bike test, which was fun. I wasn't as fit as I was at this point. MRI scan, bloods, and had a lot of discussions with the consultants about what a transplant might entail and what they were looking at to decide whether I should be put onto the waiting list or not. After the assessment, it was still undecided as to whether I should be put on the waiting list for a new liver or not. So there's a balance that needs to be right when you are being assessed for transplant. You have to be well enough to undergo the surgery of a liver transplant, but you also have to be unwell enough to warrant having a new liver. And at this point, I was right in the middle of that line. So Derriford Hospital are linked with King's College Hospital in London, because at the moment there's currently nowhere in the southwest of England that carries out liver transplants. So when you're seen at Derriford and you get to the point where you're considering being considered to have a transplant, you would eventually go to King's to have your transplant done. So King's decided they wanted me to go there to have another assessment and to make the final decision. So this assessment was a lot longer. It was over 3 days, and it included blood gas tests, a CT scan, meeting with a dietitian, anaesthetists and surgeons, and then a 3-hour education session about liver transplants. So that education session, I'm sure some of you have had that, and it's very, very intense, but it's also really, really useful. So for me, I'm the sort of person that likes to know everything about what could happen, the absolute worst case scenario and the best case scenario and everything in between. So for me, I found this really, really useful, and it was good to know what I could expect. After the assessment at King's, I was told that I would find out whether I'd be listed or not at the end of the week. So I went back home, and then a couple of days after, I got the phone call to say that I was being put on the waiting list for a new liver, and this was in July 2013. I don't think anybody wants to have a transplant, but for me at this point I was really glad to be listed. It was the only chance I saw of getting better and having my life back. So waiting for a liver transplant for me is probably the hardest part of everything that I've been through. I was really unwell at the time. I was jaundiced at this point. The fatigue was something else. The itching was uncontrollable. So it was horrendous. It was just not a nice time at all. I was really lucky though not to be in hospital and able to be at home, even though I spent most of my days in bed or on the sofa. I still made myself get up and go and do stuff and tried to keep myself as active as possible because I knew that this would give me the best chance when I was having the surgery. So if I went out and did something one day or went out with friends a couple of days, I'd have to rest for the next 2 or 3 days to catch up with myself. It was just about keeping the balance. And like everybody's life with PSC, there were good days and bad days, but the bad days were a lot worse than they were before. I couldn't make a lot of plans and I was unable to travel. So as soon as you're put on the waiting list, you're told to have your bag packed and ready to go because you could get the phone call at any point. They do give you an average time that you could expect to get the call based on your blood group. So for me, that was 18 to 24 months. It's a really emotionally challenging time for those who have been through it, I'm sure you know. Transplant is not guaranteed. You have to stay well enough to get the surgery, and as we all know, PSC is very unpredictable, so that's not always easy. And also you have to hope that the right liver becomes available at the right time. And there's a huge lack of organ donors in the UK, so this doesn't always happen. I was extremely lucky though, and I received my transplant 15 months after I was put onto the waiting list. So I got my call for transplant at 5 o'clock in the morning and was taken to King's by ambulance from my home in Somerset. I had a full liver transplant, not a split liver transplant as some PSC patients do. I was really, really lucky and there were no big complications during surgery. It all went pretty smoothly. I was in intensive care for 2 days after the surgery, then moved on to the ward. And it's a very, it's the most overwhelming experience of my life, to put it lightly, basically. Obviously, there's a lot of pain and discomfort after the surgery, but looking back now, what I remember most of the experience, the emotions that you experience at the time. So when you get the call, there's obviously a huge sense of relief. Even though it's not guaranteed until you get into the hospital and they say that the liver's viable, there's still that huge sense of relief that this could be it. And then again, when you wake up from the surgery and you're told it went well, that you had it done and it went well, again, a huge sense of relief. There's also a lot of gratitude to the donor and their family for saying yes to organ donation at the most difficult time, and a lot of sadness for the donor and their family as well. So here's some photos from my transplant in order. So the first one is about half an hour after my surgery. So I'd asked my family to keep taking photos and keep a diary of when I was in surgery because I wanted to look back on it afterwards. The next one is the day after. Always taking a selfie at any opportunity. This is learning to walk again when I was back on the ward. This is the first drink I had, because you're not allowed to drink for a couple of days afterwards, so I love orange squash. So I was the same colour as the squash though, so it's not a good look. And then the end photo is about 2 weeks afterwards when I was back at home. So big difference in a small space of time. My life since my transplant has been amazing. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that having a transplant is a walk in the park. It's definitely not, and it's different for everybody. There are going to be complications, some big, some small, but I can honestly say that my life is more full than it ever has been, and I actually feel like I have a future to look forward to now. So I went back to work 3 months after my transplant, and I've had a couple different jobs since. As Martine mentioned, I've just been appointed as PSC Support's first employee, which I'm very excited about. I'm teaching dance again, more than I ever have been, because I'm fitter than I ever have been. Even before my PSC got really advanced, I'm fitter than I was before when it was just at a low level. So yeah, very grateful. I had a lot of new qualifications, bought a house with my partner, and we're getting married next year, which is something that I didn't think I'd ever be able to do. So yeah, life is good, and I'm beyond grateful to my donor and his family for giving me my life back. Here's some pictures of what I've been up to in the last 4 years. So big milestones, and that's all thanks to organ donation. So just to round up then, just my top tips for living with PSC. Try and take each day as it comes. Obviously that's not always easy or even possible, but I found there was something good to try and aim for and just to keep in mind. Absolute number one tip, I should have put this at the start, but is talk to other PSCers. That's the biggest thing that's helped me over the last 12 years, and even now, like post-transplant, speaking to other PSC patients who've had a transplant. There's nothing like talking to people who get it and who've been through or are going through the same things as you. Your family and friends are obviously, to have people like that around you is great, but they can only understand so much. So definitely speak to other PSC patients if you can. Get onto our Facebook group, everyone's great on there. Stay informed and up to date. So you're already one step ahead by coming here today. So stay up to date with the latest research, talk to your doctors about different research trials that you can go on, and make sure you're getting your information from viable sources and not just going onto Google and falling into that trap of learning all the incorrect information. Be kind to yourself. Living with any chronic condition is really, really hard, so make sure you look after yourselves. And make the most of the good days. Thank you.